The storm had been building for 3 days over the Wyoming Territory, dark clouds gathering like an army of shadows above the Wind River Range. Dan McKenzie pulled his coat tighter as he rode through the driving snow, his horse's hooves barely finding purchase on the ice-covered trail. February of 1881 had been brutal even by frontier standards, and this blizzard promised to be the worst yet. Dan was a man of 32 years, lean and weathered from a decade of working as a territorial messenger and guide. His face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years reading distant horizons, and his hands were scarred from countless miles of rope and reins. Most importantly, he was one of the few men in the territory who knew these mountains well enough to navigate them in weather that would kill lesser riders. He had been riding for 18 hours straight, carrying urgent dispatches from Fort Bridger to the territorial capital in Cheyenne, when he saw the smoke rising from the valley below. At first, he thought it might be a rancher's chimney or perhaps a traveler's fire, but as he drew closer, he realized the smoke was coming from multiple sources, and they were arranged in the distinctive pattern of an Indian village. Dan had dealings with the Shoshone people before, and he knew their winter camps by sight. This one was larger than usual, probably housing several hundred souls who had come together for mutual protection during the harsh season. But something about the smoke troubled him. It was too thick, too irregular, the kind of smoke that came from structures burning rather than fires properly tended. He guided his horse down the treacherous slope, his military training making him approach with caution. The Shoshone were generally peaceful, but these were dangerous times, and a white man riding alone into an Indian camp was taking his life in his hands. As he drew closer, however, he began to hear sounds that made his blood run cold. The cries of children, the wails of women, and underneath it all, the terrible rattling cough that spoke of serious illness. The village was in chaos. Dan could see people moving weakly between the lodges, their movements sluggish and desperate. Bodies lay motionless in the snow, and the air carried the smell of sickness and death. This wasn't an attack or a raid, this was a plague, and it was destroying the village from within. An elderly warrior approached him, his face gaunt with illness but his bearing still proud. He spoke in halting English, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are the messenger, the one they call Fast Rider. I'm Running Bear, war chief of the mountain Shoshone." Dan had heard of Running Bear, a respected leader known for his wisdom and his efforts to maintain peace with the white authorities. Seeing him reduced to this weakened state was shocking. "Chief, what's happened here?" "The death sickness," Running Bear said, his words punctuated by fits of coughing. "It came with the last trading party, spread through the village like fire through dry grass. The children die first, then the elders. Soon, all will be gone." Dan felt his heart sink. He had seen smallpox before, during his service in the army, and he knew the devastating effect it could have on Indian populations who lacked immunity to European diseases. "How many are sick?" "No, most of the village," Running Bear replied. "Perhaps 200 souls. The medicine men try their treatments, but nothing works. The spirits have turned away from us." Dan looked around at the devastation, at the children lying motionless in their mother's arms, at the young warriors who should have been in their prime, but were now as weak as newborns. The scene was heart-wrenching, but what struck him most was the desperation in Running Bear's eyes. "There is a doctor at Fort Bridger," Running Bear continued. "Dr. Harrison, the army surgeon. He has medicines, knowledge of the white man's healing ways. But he will not come to help Indians, and we cannot reach him in this storm." Dan knew Dr. Harrison, a skilled surgeon who had served with distinction during the war. The man was competent and generally decent, but he was also a product of his time and culture. The idea of riding through a blizzard to help a Shoshone village would seem like madness to him. "You want me to bring him here?" Dan asked. Running Bear nodded weakly. "The storm is too strong for our riders. Our horses are not strong enough, and our men are too sick to make the journey. But you know these mountains, and your horse is fresh. You could reach the fort." Dan considered the proposal, his mind racing through the implications. Fort Bridger was 40 miles away through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory. In good weather, it would be a hard day's ride. In this blizzard, it would be nearly impossible, and even if he made it, there was no guarantee that Dr. Harrison would be willing to return with him. "Chief," Dan said carefully, "I'll be honest with you. The doctor might not come. The army doesn't usually provide medical care to your people." Running Bear's expression grew grave. "Then we will all die here, in this place where our fathers hunted and our mothers sang. But at least we will know that someone tried to help us." Dan looked around the village again, seeing the faces of the dying, the desperation of the survivors. He thought about his own people, about the prejudices and fears that would make most white men turn away from this suffering. But he also thought about the oath he had taken when he became a territorial messenger, to serve all the people of Wyoming regardless of race or creed. "I'll go," Dan said finally. "I'll bring the doctor back or die trying." Running Bear's eyes filled with tears. "You would do this for us, for people who are not your own?" "People in need are all the same color," Dan replied. "Red, white, or otherwise." Dan left his official dispatches with Running Bear, knowing that they would have to wait. This was more important than government business, more urgent than any territorial politics. He checked his supplies, made sure his horse was as ready as possible for the brutal journey ahead, and set out into the storm. The first mile was the hardest. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow so thick that Dan could barely see his horse's ears. The familiar trail disappeared entirely, forcing him to navigate by instinct and memory. His horse, a sturdy roan named Thunder, struggled against the drifts that sometimes reached his belly, but the animal seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. Dan had ridden these mountains in every kind of weather, but this storm was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The temperature was dropping steadily, and he could feel the cold seeping through his heavy coat, numbing his fingers and toes. His face was raw from the wind, and ice was forming on his beard and eyebrows. But he pressed on, driven by the memory of those dying children, of the desperation in Running Bear's eyes. He had given his word, and that meant something in a world where a man's reputation was often all he had. More than that, he had seen suffering, and he could not turn away from it. The trail wound through narrow canyons and across exposed ridges, each mile more treacherous than the last. Twice, Dan's horse nearly went down on the treacherous ice, and once they became completely lost in a whiteout that lasted for hours. Dan had to trust his horse's instincts, giving Thunder his head and hoping the animal could find the way when human navigation failed. At one point they came to a river crossing that should have been frozen solid, but the ice was thin and treacherous. Dan could hear the water running beneath, and he knew that if they broke through, both horse and rider would be dead within minutes. He spent an hour searching for a safer crossing, precious time that he could not afford to lose. But caution was the only thing that would get him to the fort alive. The hours blurred together in a haze of cold and exhaustion. Dan's hands were so numb that he could barely grip the reins, and his feet had lost all feeling. He began to hallucinate, seeing shapes in the snow that weren't there, hearing voices that belonged to no one. At one point, he thought he saw his father, dead these 10 years, riding beside him through the storm. But Thunder kept moving one step at a time, the faithful animal understanding that stopping meant death. Dan had trained the horse himself, had developed the kind of bond that comes from years of shared hardship and mutual dependence. If anyone could carry him through this nightmare, it was Thunder. The storm seemed to intensify as they climbed higher into the mountains, the wind becoming a constant roar that drowned out all other sounds. Dan's world narrowed to the space immediately around his horse, to the need to keep moving, to the desperate hope that he was still on the right trail. It was well past midnight when Dan finally saw the lights of Fort Bridger through the swirling snow. The sight was so beautiful, so impossible, that he thought he might be dreaming. But Thunder's exhausted whinny brought him back to reality, and he urged the horse forward the last few hundred yards to the fort's gates. The sentries nearly shot him, mistaking him for a hostile in the swirling snow, but they recognized him at the last moment and brought him inside. Dan could barely speak, his voice hoarse from hours of breathing the frigid air, but he managed to explain his mission to the duty officer. Dr. Harrison was not pleased to be awakened in the middle of the night, especially when he learned the nature of Dan's request. The doctor was a man of 55, skilled and dedicated, but also set in his ways and suspicious of anything that deviated from established protocol. "You want me to ride 40 miles in a blizzard to treat Indians?" Harrison said, his voice thick with disbelief. "McKenzie, have you lost your mind?" Dan had expected this reaction, but he was prepared for it. "Doctor, there are 200 people dying out there. Children mostly. They've got smallpox, and they need medical attention." "Then they should have stayed on the reservation where they belong," Dr. Harrison replied coldly. "I'm not risking my life for a bunch of savages who probably brought this on themselves." Dan felt his temper flare, but he kept his voice steady. "Doctor, I've seen what's happening in that village. It's not about politics or race. It's about people who are suffering and dying, and you're the only one who can help them." "I'm a military surgeon, not a missionary," Harrison said. "My responsibility is to Army personnel, not to every Indian band that gets itself in trouble." Dan tried a different approach. "What about the Hippocratic Oath? Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Harrison's face flushed with anger. "Don't quote medical ethics to me, McKenzie. I've saved more lives than you'll ever know. But I draw the line at suicidal missions to help people who would scalp me the moment I turn my back." Dan realized that appeals to compassion were not going to work. He would have to find another way to motivate the doctor. "What if I told you that Running Bear has promised to share information about Shoshone winter camps? Intelligence that could prevent attacks on white settlements?" It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that might save lives. Harrison's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," Dan said, hating himself for the deception, but knowing it was necessary. "But only if you help them. If they all die, you get nothing." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but I want an escort, and I want hazard pay for this." "I'll be your escort," Dan said, "and I'll personally guarantee your payment." The return journey was even worse than the first. Doctor. Harrison was not an experienced rider, and the additional weight of medical supplies made the going slower and more dangerous. The doctor complained constantly about the cold, the wind, and the foolishness of the entire enterprise. But Dan pressed on, driven by the memory of the dying village and the promise he had made to Running Bear. He stayed close to Harrison, helping him when his horse stumbled, sharing his own warmth when the doctor seemed ready to give up. Twice they had to stop to rest the horses, and once they were forced to take shelter in a cave when the wind became too strong to continue. During these breaks, Dan found himself talking to Harrison about the Shoshone people, trying to break down the doctor's prejudices with stories of their courage, their dignity, their humanity. "They're not what you think," Dan said during one of their rest stops. "They're not savages or animals. They're people just like us, trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast for them to understand." Harrison listened, his expression slowly softening. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I know it," Dan replied. "I've traded with them, fought alongside them, shared their fires. They're good people, Doctor. They deserve a chance to live." As they resumed their journey, Dan could see that his words were having an effect. Harrison began to ask questions about Shoshone culture, about their customs and beliefs. The doctor was beginning to see his patients as individuals, rather than as members of a hostile race. They reached the Shoshone village just as dawn was breaking, the storm finally beginning to abate. What they found was even worse than Dan had left. More bodies lay in the snow, and the survivors were barely clinging to life. The village was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional cough or moan. Running Bear was still alive, but barely. He greeted Dan with tears of gratitude, his voice so weak that Dan had to lean close to hear him. "You came back," he whispered. "I did not think it was possible." "I gave my word," Dan replied. "This is Dr. Harrison. He's going to help you." What followed was 3 days of intensive medical work, with Dr. Harrison throwing himself into the fight against the disease with single-minded determination. He set up a makeshift hospital in the largest lodge, organized the survivors into nursing teams, and began administering the treatments he had brought from the fort. Dan found himself serving as translator, organizer, and general assistant, helping to coordinate the relief effort. He watched as the doctor's initial reluctance gave way to genuine concern for his patients, as professional duty transformed into something approaching compassion. "These people are incredibly resilient," Harrison said to Dan on the second night as they took a brief rest between patients. "In a white settlement, this outbreak would have killed half the population. But they're fighting back with everything they have." Dan nodded, having seen the same thing. Despite their lack of immunity to European diseases, the Shoshone were proving to be remarkably tough patients. Their traditional community structure, their willingness to care for each other even at great personal risk, was helping many of them survive who might otherwise have died. On the third day, the crisis began to pass. The fever broke in patient after patient, and the terrible coughing that had filled the village began to subside. Children who had been near death sat up and asked for food. Elderly warriors who had been preparing for their final journey began to talk about spring hunting. Dr. Harrison had saved the village, but he had also been changed by the experience. Dan watched as the doctor said goodbye to his patients, seeing genuine affection in his eyes as he spoke to children he had nursed back to health. "I want to thank you," Harrison said to Dan as they prepared to leave. "I didn't want to come here, but I'm glad you forced me to. I've learned something about these people, about their strength and their dignity. They're not what I expected." Dan smiled, knowing that the doctor's changed perspective was almost as important as the lives he had saved. Maybe that's the most important medicine of all. They left the village amid promises of friendship and mutual aid, with Running Bear swearing that the Shoshone would remember this kindness for generations. Dan thought it was the end of the story, but he was wrong. 2 weeks later, as he was preparing to resume his normal duties as a territorial messenger, Dan received an unexpected visitor. A young Shoshone warrior named Swift Arrow had ridden to his cabin, bearing a message from Running Bear. "My chief wishes to speak with you," Swift Arrow said. "He says it is a matter of great importance." Dan rode back to the village, curious about what could be so urgent. What he found was a community transformed. The lodges that had been scenes of death and despair were now bustling with activity. Children played in the snow, women worked at their traditional crafts, and the men were already planning for the spring hunt. Running Bear greeted him at the entrance to the village, his health fully restored, and his bearing once again that of a proud chief. "My friend," he said, embracing Dan warmly, "you have given us the greatest gift possible, the gift of life itself. Now we must decide how to repay such a debt." Dan was uncomfortable with the talk of debt and repayment. "Chief, I don't expect anything in return. I did what any decent man would do." "But that is exactly the point," Running Bear replied. "You did what any decent man would do, but you were the only one who actually did it. That makes you special, and special people deserve special recognition." He led Dan to the center of the village, where a large group had gathered. Dan recognized many faces, people he had helped care for during the crisis, children whose lives had been saved by his desperate ride through the storm. "We have decided," Running Bear announced, "that you will be adopted into our tribe. You will be given a Shoshone name, and you will be welcome in any Shoshone lodge for as long as you live." Dan felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was an honor that few white men had ever received, a recognition of character that transcended racial boundaries. "Chief, I'm deeply honored, but I don't know if I'm worthy of such a gift." "You are worthy," Running Bear said firmly. "You risked your life for people you barely knew, people your own kind considers enemies. You showed courage when others showed cowardice, compassion when others showed cruelty. That is the measure of a true warrior." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Dan had ever experienced. He was given the name Rides Through Storm in honor of his desperate journey to save the village. He was presented with traditional clothing, weapons, and jewelry that marked him as a member of the tribe. Most importantly, he was given a place in the complex social structure of the Shoshone people. But the tribe's gratitude extended far beyond symbolic gestures. In the weeks that followed, Dan discovered that his new family had practical gifts that would change his life forever. The Shoshone possessed knowledge of the territory that no white man had ever dreamed of: secret trails through the mountains, hidden water sources, mineral deposits that had never been mapped by government surveyors. They shared this knowledge freely, helping Dan become one of the most skilled guides in the region. His reputation spread quickly, and soon he was being hired by wealthy Easterners who wanted to explore the wilderness, by government survey teams who needed someone who could navigate the most treacherous terrain, and by military units who required guides who could move unseen through hostile territory. The financial rewards were substantial, but more importantly, Dan found himself with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a messenger carrying other people's words from place to place. He was a bridge between two cultures, a man who could move freely in both worlds and help each side understand the other. The Shoshone also introduced him to trading opportunities that he had never known existed. They had connections with tribes throughout the West, and they facilitated business relationships that proved extremely profitable. Dan found himself dealing in everything from horses and furs to rare minerals and medicinal plants. But perhaps the most significant development was his introduction to Running Bear's daughter, a young woman named Morning Star. She was 25 years old, beautiful and intelligent, and she had been one of the people Dan had helped save during the smallpox outbreak. Their initial meeting was formal, conducted according to traditional Shoshone customs, but Dan was immediately struck by her grace and dignity. Morning Star had been educated by missionary teachers as well as by her own people, and she spoke perfect English along with several native languages. She was deeply involved in her tribe's affairs, serving as an advisor to her father and as a bridge between the traditional ways and the changing world around them. Their courtship was slow and careful, conducted under the watchful eyes of the entire tribe. Dan had to prove himself worthy not just through his past actions, but through his continued commitment to the Shoshone people. He learned their language, participated in their ceremonies, and demonstrated his understanding of their customs and beliefs. The relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. Morning Star had witnessed Dan's courage during the crisis, had seen him work tirelessly to save her people without regard for his own safety. She understood that he was not just another white man seeking to exploit her people, but someone who genuinely cared about their welfare. Their marriage was celebrated with a ceremony that brought together hundreds of people from across the territory. White settlers, cavalry officers, territorial officials, and members of various tribes all came to honor the union between the white messenger and the Shoshone princess. It was a symbol of the kind of cooperation and understanding that was possible when people looked beyond race to character. Dr. Harrison served as Dan's best man, having maintained his friendship with both Dan and the Shoshone people. The doctor had been profoundly changed by his experience in the village, and he had become an advocate for better medical care for Native Americans throughout the territory. "You started something that day," Harrison told Dan during the wedding celebration. "You showed that it was possible to bridge the gap between our peoples, to find common ground based on shared humanity." Dan's married life was rich and fulfilling in ways he had never imagined. Morning Star was not just a wife, but a partner in every sense of the word. She helped him navigate the complex world of tribal politics, advised him on business matters, and served as his interpreter and cultural guide in his dealings with various native groups. Their children were born into a world that was changing rapidly, but they were equipped to handle that change. They grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in both worlds. They learned to hunt and fish from their Shoshone relatives, but they also received formal education that prepared them for success in white society. Dan's reputation as a bridge between cultures made him invaluable to territorial authorities, who were finally beginning to understand that cooperation was more effective than confrontation. He helped negotiate treaties, prevented conflicts, and facilitated trade relationships that benefited both sides. But it was his role as a family man that gave him the greatest satisfaction. He had found love and acceptance in the most unlikely place, had built a life that honored both his heritage and his adopted culture. The lonely messenger who had once ridden from place to place with nothing but his horse and his thoughts had become the center of a large extended family that included not just his wife and children, but hundreds of Shoshone relatives. Years later, when Dan was an old man with gray hair and a weathered face that reflected decades of frontier life, he would look back on that desperate ride through the blizzard as the defining moment of his life. He had been asked to choose between safety and service, between comfort and compassion, and he had chosen to serve. The Shoshone people had returned with more than gratitude. They had returned with acceptance, with love, with the gift of belonging to something greater than himself. They had shown him that heroism was not about grand gestures or dramatic battles, but about simple human decency in the face of suffering. The messenger who had ridden through the storm had found more than just a new family. He had found his place in the world, his purpose in life, and his path to redemption. In saving others, he had saved himself, and in bridging the gap between peoples, he had discovered the truth that would guide him for the rest of his days. That love and compassion recognize no boundaries of race or creed, and that the greatest adventures begin when we choose to help rather than to hide. The storm had passed, but the bonds forged in its fury would endure for generations, a testament to the power of one man's choice to ride for help when no one else would, and to the profound gratitude of a people who knew the true value of such courage.